A 125% tariff sounds terrifying, like the US is delivering a knockout punch to China. But is this really a victory? In less than 1 week, that tariff was slashed down to just 10%, a humiliating retreat. America now stands at a crossroads: cling to its pride or admit defeat in this fierce trade war. So who's truly winning and who is bearing the real cost? In early May 2025, Donald Trump stepped up to the podium, his face beaming as if he had just scored a spectacular win. Before a sea of cameras, he boldly announced what he called the strongest tariff move ever against China, raising import duties all the way up to 125%. He hailed it as a historic turning point in the trade war, promising that millions of jobs would return to American shores. In his view, this was the decisive blow that would force Beijing to back down. Supporters cheered loudly. Trump-friendly media ran headlines screaming, "Big win!" The story sounded exciting, but just days later, the truth became impossible to hide. On May 12th, in Geneva, the US entered negotiations with China, this time without the same fire and bravado from the tariff announcement. Just 1 week after unleashing the tariff hammer, the American economy began overheating, quite literally. Prices shot up, imports piled up at ports, and countless small and medium businesses cried out in frustration, unable to cope. Coastal states like California, New York, and Washington, home to major ports and businesses, reacted strongly. Political pressure mounted, and the Trump administration quietly backed down. At the negotiating table, the US lowered tariffs to 10%, nearly back to square one. Meanwhile, China barely budged, setting just one simple condition. If America wanted its goods flowing again, it must promise not to raise tariffs above 20% for a full year. America agreed. No fanfare, no celebration, just a silent step backward. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, usually reserved, stepped in front of the press and said plainly, this was a difficult but necessary decision to protect the national supply chain. It was a quiet admission, but loud enough to show the situation was far worse than the administration's public stance. Still, Trump's campaign team and loyal media kept pushing the victory narrative. They insisted this was a strategic move, forcing China to yield. But experts and those closely watching the talks saw it differently. Many described it as a weak compromise, a defensive maneuver rather than an offensive one. In plain terms, the US had conceded because it simply had no other choice. When President Trump imposed harsh tariffs, he might have thought he was throwing the first punch, but just days later, China not only absorbed the blow, but launched an extremely well-planned counterattack. And the first place to feel the impact was not the White House, but the West Coast ports of the United States. On the 1st of May 2025, China made a clear, concise, and powerful statement. It would stop issuing new orders to the US. For a port system heavily dependent on trade with China, this news was a thunderbolt. 2 days later, on the 3rd of May, life at the ports had not yet changed. On average, 41 container ships from China were still arriving daily. Port workers, truck drivers, logistics staff. Everyone hoped this tension was only temporary, but only 6 days later, harsh reality set in. On the 9th of May 2025, the number of ships arriving from China plummeted from 41 to 0. Not a single vessel, not a single container. The Port of Los Angeles, America's largest gateway for trade with Asia, experienced for the first time in over 70 years no ship horns from China. That silence was not only strange, but terrifying. In less than a week, more than 50,000 standard containers, TEUs, were canceled or delayed. Huge warehouses began to empty. Retailers had no goods to stock on shelves. Factories lacked components for production, and logistics companies fell into panic. This paralysis spread like dominoes, which normally shuttled tirelessly between ports and warehouses, now stood still. One driver shared, "I used to make 6 trips a day, now it's just 1. Some days, none at all." And what was inevitable happened. Logistics revenues dropped by as much as 40% in just 5 days. These numbers were not just on paper, they hit every company and every family relying on transportation, commerce, and warehousing. When one port is paralyzed, it's a big deal. But when the 2 biggest ports in the US simultaneously freeze, the consequences extend beyond California. Inland states face shortages of raw materials, the national supply chain falls into chaos, consumers face the risk of rising prices and shortages. Beijing's counterattack was not loud. It wasn't missiles or warships, but it struck the US where it is most vulnerable, an economy tied closely to globalization. If Los Angeles and Long Beach are the busiest trade gateways, the port of Seattle in Washington state is also crucial in America's supply chain, especially for maritime routes from Asia. On the 7th of May 2025, a somber milestone was reached. For the first time in a decade, no container ships from Asia docked at the port of Seattle. An unusual silence, as if this famous port had suddenly fallen into a long slumber. This led to a clear consequence. Berth utilization rates dropped to only 30%. Vast warehouses grew deserted, cranes and equipment ceased operation, and activity nearly ground to a halt. Moreover, major shipping companies such as Maersk, COSCO, and Evergreen, familiar names on trans-Pacific routes, had to suspend their shipping lines to Seattle and the nearby port of Tacoma. This decision was the clearest signal of the severity of the current supply chain crisis. Seattle, once a vibrant trade hub, now stands as a vivid example of China's powerful counterstrike in the trade war many thought the US was winning. We have seen the difficulties on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, home to major ports like New York and New Jersey, the situation is no easier. In just the first week of May 2025, imports at these ports dropped by 30%. This figure is not merely a decline, it triggered a chain of cascading effects. Not only were foreign goods stuck outside, but domestic companies also faced difficulties as exports piled up. The reason? A shortage of empty containers, the boxes usually shipped from China, paralyzing exports. The Port of New York, New Jersey is witnessing a paradox. Domestic goods cannot be shipped out, while foreign goods cannot come in. This situation traps the entire East Coast in an unprecedented congestion spiral. It's not only the ports that are struggling, but even the giants of the shipping industry. Maersk, Evergreen, COSCO, and Ecomim have not escaped the severe impact of this tense trade war. In the first weeks of May 2025, they had to cut their US-China shipments by 30 to 40%. Some regularly scheduled vessels were canceled or temporarily suspended. Disruptions in trade left these companies frozen, forced to adjust operations to cope with fewer goods, greater risks, and undoubtedly diminished profits. This impact is not limited to shipping companies, but ripples across the entire global supply chain, forcing every link to scramble for ways to adapt. When the flow of goods from China was disrupted, the impact did not stop at the ports or shipping companies. The entire United States began to feel the shockwaves, spreading to every store and every household. Did you know that as early as the beginning of May, retail giants like Walmart, Target, and Best Buy started sounding alarms over severe shortages? Electronics, clothing, school supplies, all became scarce. There was no longer enough stock to fill shelves, and customers stood waiting in long lines, but still couldn't buy what they needed. Technology products fared no better. Laptop prices from Dell, HP, and Apple suddenly surged by $80 to $150 per unit. Why? Because essential components all came from China, and now they couldn't arrive. Not only that, school backpacks and satchels increased in price by as much as 30%. Toys and decorative items for festivals nearly disappeared from the market. Even more concerning, the domestic transportation system was paralyzed. Trucks had to run empty, and drivers could only take between 30 and 50% of their usual trips. From Texas to Illinois, logistics warehouses reported capacity drops of 60 to 70%. This means goods were not only difficult to import, but also hard to move within the country. An entire large supply chain was broken, from import to distribution, plunging the US economy into an unprecedented state of instability. The bad news did not stop at shortages. In the first days of May alone, more than 200,000 workers in logistics, port operations, and transportation suddenly faced the risk of job loss or work disruptions. These were the truck drivers, warehouse employees, and those ensuring smooth goods movement. Yet within less than 2 weeks, their lives were completely upended. And when goods became scarce, prices began to jump in unwanted directions. In just 1 week, consumer prices in the US soared by 5 to 8%. The experience of grocery shopping and buying essentials became more expensive than ever before. Farmers in the Midwest were not spared hardship either. They produced quality agricultural goods but could no longer sell them to China. Particularly, California lost up to 40% of its agricultural export market share to the world's most populous country. This translated to severe income losses, pushing many families into difficult circumstances. Looking at the United States, California is the economic powerhouse with a GDP reaching nearly $4 trillion, $100 billion, and a population of close to 40 million people. Yet this very state is suffering the heaviest losses in the tariff war with China. About 80% of goods imported from China into the US pass through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which are now paralyzed due to China's retaliatory measures. Key industries such as high technology, agriculture, and renewable energy face the risk of stalling. Governor Gavin Newsom did not remain silent. On May 13th, he appeared on the program Fox and Friends with a strong statement. The tariff policy is strangling California and ultimately hurting the American people. These words sounded a clear warning about the real consequences of the trade war. Not stopping at words alone, Newsom held a press conference right at the Port of Oakland with 7 major transportation companies, urging the federal government for a temporary tariff exemption to save the local economy. He also proposed bolder steps: direct negotiations with China without going through the federal government, forming a tariff opposition alliance with other large states like New York, Washington, and Texas, and taking the case to the World Trade Organization, WTO, claiming that federal tariff policies violate international trade commitments. But California is not just opposing. The state is preparing a strong recovery plan focused on developing future industries. Intel is expanding its chip factory in Santa Clara, TSMC is setting up a wafer plant in Silicon Valley, and Tesla is investing more capital to expand its gigafactory in Fremont. These moves aim to build a sustainable economy less dependent on external forces. California stands in the eye of the tariff storm, but with determination and strategic moves, it refuses to yield easily. This story is not just a lesson in trade. It is a stark warning about how hasty decisions can deeply wound a nation's economy. When the numbers and so-called victory claims don't align with reality on the ground, who truly bears the cost? In this game of power and politics, America must take a hard look at itself and reconsider its strategy before suffering even greater losses. And as tensions show no sign of easing, the remaining question is, who will take up the flag and lead America back to balance in this trade war?